Dear viewers, welcome you all again on Frankly Speaking. Our today's guest is Eric M. Usianer, a visiting professor from United States of America. Usianer is a professor of government and politics and has taught University of Maryland Clark Park College since 1975. Professor Usianer, a widely traveled scholar across the globe, whose research focus is on some areas which has a very significant relevance with the prevailing situation in Bangladesh. Some of his major works related with fighting corruption, building governance, and moral foundation of trust, and many others. Welcome you all on Frankly Speaking, Professor Usianer.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Nice to you. Sir, your main focus, major interest area is moral foundation of trust. So what do you mean and what is your perception on trust?
Okay. This type of trust is trust among people. Not so much the same thing as trust in government. People learn it at an early age, mostly from their parents, and it stays stable throughout most of their lives. So this becomes a moral value that allows people to work with and cooperate with people who may be different from themselves, whom they may not know. Now, trust is basically not only a moral value, but most people have a predisposition to trust only people like themselves rather than to trust strangers, people who are not like themselves. And there are only a handful of countries in the world where a majority of the people actually trust strangers who may be different from themselves.
The major areas of trust, generally people in a country across the nation believes and mostly trust on the politicians. Okay. But when we see that the politicians breaches the trust of the people, then what happens in that case?
Well, that's a different type of trust than a moral foundation of trust. That's a type of trust that is largely based upon people's evaluations of government performance, of honesty, and of how well the government is doing in keeping the peace and keeping the economy sound. When people lose confidence in their leaders, they tend to do one of two things. Either they withdraw from politics or they get involved in politics and react against the powers that be.
What was the situation in Eastern and Central Europe in terms of fighting corruption?
Well, let's start off with what happened before Central and Eastern Europe broke the bonds of communism. Under communism, there was a tremendous degree of corruption. Key leaders felt free to expropriate for themselves lots of public resources. And many people in transition countries had hoped, right after transition, that democracy would bring an end to corruption. But two things happened to prevent that. First of all, while the people in Central and Eastern Europe had developed democratic institutions, they had not really developed a democratic spirit.
Okay.
So they had just an institutional shell, but they did not really have...
You're talking about post-89 or...
Yes, post-89.
Okay.
Yeah. They hadn't really taken control of the political process for themselves. And one of the reasons why this occurred was that there was tremendous growth in economic inequality after transition, as some people prospered by the new regime and other people no longer had the protection of the state. So this growth of inequality fostered the growth of more corruption, as well as weak institutions that look good from the outside but really didn't have fair legal practices and that didn't have a public spirit of participation and reconciliation.
You mentioned that the lack of democratic spirit prevails in that society. Countries like Bangladesh, where most people can hardly read or write, so do you think that the ideal form of democracy works can sustain in this society?
I don't want to comment on an ideal form of democracy, but let me suggest that where there is a tremendous degree of economic inequality and poverty, you wind up with a situation where people become dependent upon political leaders for their very survival. These leaders provide jobs, these leaders provide economic security, they provide the basic aspects of life. That means that these leaders talk about what they can bring to specific individuals or groups. They don't offer people alternative policies on which to judge their political parties, their political candidacies. And that means that the people really don't have the leverage to control the politicians that they really need to have to curb corruption.
Can you suggest, Professor Usianer, an ideal form of way how to deal with the pervasive, rampant corruption in the least developed countries like Bangladesh?
Okay, you need good institutions, but beyond good institutions, you need to develop what I talked about as the democratic spirit, the idea that people can take control of their own economic and political lives by freeing themselves of corrupt politicians. Now, you're not going to do this by getting politicians at the top to all of a sudden say, oh, how we have been very, very bad people and we're going to reform. You've got to do this by making individuals not dependent upon these corrupt leaders. So how do you do this? You need to have a set of social welfare policies that basically guarantees universal education to everyone in a society. And if you look at countries that have conquered corruption, you see that they have two things. They do have the strong institutions to combat corruption, but they also have developed extensive public education programs, and public education does two things. First of all, it builds trust in other people, and people who are more trusting feel bad about cheating people who may be different from themselves. But secondly, it creates economic opportunities and opportunities for people to find their own jobs independent of political leaders. And once they become independent of political leaders and can find their own jobs, there's no reason for them to support these corrupt leaders at all. They can vote them out of power and vote for candidates who promise them issue positions that they agree with. And I talk about this in my book, The Bulging Pocket and the Rule of Law, Corruption, Inequality, and Trust, which will come out maybe within a year from Cambridge University Press, and show that this same pattern has held in most of the key cases where corruption has been successfully combated. In Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Botswana, in the Nordic countries, in the United States. So case after case study points to the same general prescription for curbing corruption. Now, there's a bit of bad news here. Bad news is two pieces of bad news. First, this is not an overnight solution. Universal public education takes a long time to develop. And secondly, it's not a cheap solution. It's an extremely expensive solution that you may say many, many poor countries cannot afford. And my answer to that is you cannot afford not to do it.
Can you share on the experience of Botswana? How it's a hardly very least developed country in the world. So how did they fight this problem?
Botswana had a couple of things going for it. One, it had an enlightened leadership that realized that fighting corruption was important. It also faced an external threat from South Africa. So this leadership was able to convince the public that they needed to do extensive market liberalization, and that meant curbing corruption, in order to preserve Botswana's independence.
Okay.
That Botswana's independence, in the same way that Singapore and Hong Kong, their leaders convinced the public that they faced an external threat from China, and that the independence of Singapore and Hong Kong depended upon public support for these economic reforms and anti-corruption campaigns that political leaders proposed. However, none of these policies could easily be adopted without doing two things: convincing the public that it had a role to play. So in Botswana, Singapore, and Hong Kong, there were mass public education campaigns, including at the elementary school levels, where young people learned that corruption was wrong. And parents participated in these programs. Ordinary people were told if they ever see corruption, they report it. You'd ride on the Hong Kong subways, even now when Hong Kong has already become clean, and you see big signs saying, see corruption, call the Anti-Corruption Commission, involving the citizenry in getting involved in the democratic spirit. But second, they had to convince people in all three places, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Botswana, that there was something in it for them to fight corruption. Because you can say, yes, well, I have a moral obligation to fight corruption, but I also have a moral obligation to keep myself alive.
Right.
And under the corrupt regimes in these countries, leaders dominated people, and people needed to rely upon corrupt leaders in order to survive. So what the leaders in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Botswana did was establish tremendous social services, including universal education, saying, here's the deal. If you support anti-corruption drives, we're going to make your life better so you don't need to rely upon corruption.
Okay. You're sharing your experience on Hong Kong, Singapore, and Botswana. Yeah. But do you think the corruption of the political regime and political leaders is solely responsible for damaging our country's moral structure, apart from the administrative corruption is more pervasive for the society?
I think that what happens in most countries, and again, I can't speak to Bangladesh, is that people look at different forms of corruption and make different judgments. And I think the key distinction is between grand corruption, the corruption done by political leaders, business people, and petty corruption, the sort of corruption that goes on in daily life where people may have to pay the doctor extra to be seen, where people may have to pay the police officer if they get a speeding ticket or if they're caught on the highway, and people have to pay the clerk at a government office to get something done. That's petty corruption. And the big difference is how much money is involved. Now, for petty corruption, people think it's wrong. But that does not cause them to lose faith either in their political leaders, in other people, or to believe that economic inequality in a country is rising. Why? Because the sums involved in petty corruption are fairly small. So if you have to pay the doctor extra to be seen, or pay the police officer or the clerk at a government office, he or she may be able to take his spouse out for a nice dinner. But they're not going to get a huge bank account in the Cayman Islands or in Switzerland. But when people see big-time corruption for political leaders, they see these political leaders getting rich, they see them getting special deals that they can never hope to get, and they really see a divide between the rich and the poor. So, big corruption leads people to believe that inequality is increasing in society and that the only way that they can get rich is by being corrupt.
The sum of money a country getting from local source or foreign funding agencies. Suppose it has been allocated for the poverty alleviation program, but most of the monies are siphoning off to the political and the administrative arms. This has immensely contributed for not alleviating the poverty, the dire poverty in the developing countries like Bangladesh. So how to improve the governance system in these countries?
Okay. Well, this is all part of what I call an inequality trap in my book. You start out with high levels of inequality. You move to low levels of trust, where people think that other people are trying to cheat them, and particularly if other people aren't part of your own inner circle, your own group reference, then it's okay to cheat them back. Maybe it's not morally acceptable, but you may have no alternative. It becomes less morally reprehensible. That leads to higher levels of corruption, and for the very reasons you just mentioned, that leads back to higher levels of inequality. So you wind up with this vicious circle. We're going from inequality to low trust to high corruption back to high inequality. And that's not easy to break. In general, the countries,
it's a vicious circle.
Yeah, the countries that were unequal in the 1960s are unequal today. The countries that were low trusting in the 1980s, first time trust was measured cross-nationally, are less trusting today. The countries that were more corrupt in 1980, the first time Transparency International measured corruption, are corrupt today. So you basically have a cycle that is very, very difficult to break. And that's why small-scale reforms can help in the short term. They can help get rid of particularly bad politicians, but they're not going to solve the ultimate problem of what I call this inequality trap. The only way you are going to get a long-term solution to the problem of corruption is to attack it at its source, which is inequality. And there we go back to, as I said before, universal public education.
I know that you worked on the American political system. So how the American United States political parties maintain the transparency and accountable to the donors or who contribute to the party fund?
Now, the Federal Elections Commission may make this more transparent. It may provide better information. It may exonerate people in certain ways. But from what I've seen in many countries in the world, people have a pretty good idea of who the honest and corrupt politicians are. And the ultimate solution depends upon their willingness to punish dishonest politicians and their ability to make the judgment that they can survive or at least prosper without these politicians in office.
So one more thing I would like to know from you. How an election commission can function to hold a free and fair elections generally, on your general experience?
Okay, well, that's not something I've worked on, but let me suggest that simply holding a free and fair election is only part of the problem. What you need to have is a free and fair election that gives people a real choice of alternative policies. Because you can have a free and fair election between two candidates, both of whom promise jobs for people. And in the end, the one who wins will generally be the one who's been around for a long time. Now, that election may be free and fair. People choose to re-elect the corrupt politician because their lives depended upon it. Having a free and fair election only does part of the job. Having an election with a real choice does the bigger part of the job. And for that, you're required to do some work, again, to force the political parties to talk about issues and values and needs that reflect the priorities of real, everyday people.
Thank you very much, Professor Usianer, for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dear viewers, it's a no denying fact that we all dream of building a prosperous and beautiful Bangladesh for the present and future generation. We want to live in peace and happiness. We don't want Bangladesh where injustice and unfairness prevail anymore. Professor Eric Usianer emphasized on maintaining trust, be it in political arena or in every sphere of life. He shared some of his thoughts on many important areas, especially fighting corruption. Hopefully, in our way forward, we can make some best use of his good thoughts in our actions for our better future. Thank you all once again for staying with us, and see you on next episode. Till then, bye-bye.